Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Le Cercle d'Economistes, and Economic Society of Singapore, we would like to welcome you to the Singapore-France Economic Forum 2019, New Horizons for the World Economy. My name is Gail, and I'm a research associate at, at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and it is my honor to be your MC for this event. To begin the program for today, it is my pleasure to invite Professor David Lee at the Singapore University of Social Sciences, His Excellency Marc Abensour, Ambassador of France to Singapore, Mr. Nicolas Colin, co-founder and partner of the family, Mr. Sopnendu Mohenty, Chief Fintech Officer of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, Ms. Tan Bin Ru, Chief Executive Officer, OneConnect Singapore, on stage for the panel discussion on disruption, fintech, and innovation, who will be the winners. Panelists, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Lee. I'm from Singapore University of Social Sciences. I'm also the Vice President of Academic Society of Singapore. I would like to welcome you to this conference, and I would like to thank our partners, our counterpart from France, and also the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And it's no better time to look at the new horizons for the new economy and for the global economy at the same time. And today's session is one of the very disruptive one, and for some of you probably you just come from Europe, and some of you just travel from Europe, coming back from Basel. I think the only disruption to you is probably your sleep. But the title today is Disruption, Fintech and Innovation, Who Will Be the Winners? And there's no better partner from Singapore with, to have the French ambassador in France and our friends from France to come here and discuss, because the French has been very innovative. And I'm sure some of you will know that the word entrepreneurship or entrepreneur comes from the French verb, okay, by a very famous economist, and probably you're familiar with the Say law by Jean-Baptiste Say. And Say studied the Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, and while he agreed on most of the points in that book, he found that the omission of enterprising businessmen was a serious flaw. So then we have the US President Thomas Jefferson, read the English translation and tried to convince Say to teach in his new nation. Although Say never stepped foot on US, he actually had a great influence on Thomas Jefferson, and the US wholeheartedly went into the Industrial Revolution and emerged with one of the strongest economies in the world. So that's a very good example of how innovative the French is. And there's a lot of history with Singapore as well. And in 1935, the French missionary came to Singapore and set up a Sino-English school. A Sino-English school means that the first language of the school is Chinese. So the French actually came to Singapore and set up a school, and that school is by the name Catholic High School. And I'm sure some of you are familiar that our Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, is an alumnus of the Catholic High School. So there is a lot of connection with the French, and it shows how innovative, how adventurous, and how entrepreneurs from every aspect of the French people. And today here with us, we have four very distinguished speakers and panel speakers. I will let them introduce themselves, but I will just briefly mention their affiliation. On my left is Ms. Tan Bin Ru. She's currently the CEO of OneConnect Financial Technology, which is a subsidiary of Ping An Insurance from China. And on her left is His Excellency Ambassador Marc Abensour. Well, we all know that he's a diplomat, and he has many experiences across many fields, and more importantly, he has not only stayed in Singapore, but has been First Secretary in China for a number of years, as well as in America. And on his left, I think you have been in Singapore, and those who have been in Singapore for a long time in the fintech scene will know the leading thought leaders in fintech in the world is Miss Sopnendu Mohenty, which I call him Mohenty. He just landed from Basel and is traveling to Egypt this evening. So we really, it's a great pleasure to have him, who is the Chief FinTech Officer from the Central Bank Monetary Authority of Singapore. And on his left, we have Nicolas Colin, who lives in London, but has a very interesting career. He writes his own blog, he has his own book, Hatch. I think he will talk more about that. But he was from the civil service, and he has his experience spanned across taxation, privacy protection, which is very interesting for us to discuss about the digital world in terms of protecting privacy at this juncture. So without further ado, I will actually invite each of them to talk a little bit about what they do, a little bit of their past experience, and what their companies are now doing to take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution. And I'll pass it to you, Binru. Would you like to tell us what exactly is OneConnect doing at this moment?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So, morning, everybody. So, Ping An Group is the largest insurance in China. We're also an integrated financial conglomerate in China, as in we have the bank, we have asset management, we have securities, etc. And the Ping An Group started OneConnect, which is the fintech arm of the Ping An Group 3 years ago in China. I take care of Singapore HQ, which is for Southeast Asia expansion. We started here last year. And OneConnect basically brings innovative technologies that's used by the Ping An Group, and we commercialize it and we sell it to the commercial banks, the insurance companies, etc. A couple of examples of such innovative tech that's highly debated and highly, evaluated by a lot of banks. Say, for example, the KYC. A lot of the Singapore banks are evaluating all the KYC. So today, as a Singaporean, I think maybe not many Singaporeans here, our banks here are still using passwords and PINs and OTP PINs on your phone. And we're slowly evaluating facial recognition together with voice print. So we believe that we call our KYC Plus. In the future, you will log into your internet banking via your face as well as saying your name or something. So that's one very basic example. Maybe another example would be loans, micro loans. So all in Southeast Asia, a lot of banks are also looking at venturing into the unbanked. So how to evaluate credit score for someone you do not know, has no income statement, etc. So we use a technology called micro-expression interviews. So over the phone, you do an interview. We put in a lot of research for 3 years on this technology. We got psychiatrists, Chinese fortune tellers, all kinds of things in terms of analyzing human behaviors, your facial muscles, etc. For all kinds of signs, whether or not we think you are honest and transparent with what you are sharing over the interview. Of course, the AI logic doesn't decide if you are telling the truth or if I can loan you the money. The loan manager assess. Basically, the interview gets longer when there's a lot of red flags. Maybe what you are saying is not so consistent. Maybe your eyes are looking all over the place, etc. Or your body language just doesn't look comfortable or awkward. And the loan manager then decides whether he wants to loan you the money, depending on the number of red flags there. Yeah. So maybe these are just 2 examples. We have a whole lot more others, but I'll give airtime to the rest.
I'll be very careful with my expression now. Yeah, I think it's very interesting to know that the Ping An Group has just landed in Singapore about a year ago. And I think OneConnect has increased the number of employees from when I first knew you. You were saying that you're the 5th employee. Now you have about 200 employees. Yes. And that's just one subsidiary of Ping An, but there are other subsidiaries like Lu International, which has another 100. So certainly have created a lot of jobs. a lot of new horizons for a lot of people in Singapore in the last 12 months. And one thing that I find it very interesting is your vein recognition. You know, not only voice recognition, face recognition, you have vein recognition that you can look at the fingers, our face, and the veins, you know, whenever that we feel embarrassed or we are lying, that we have to be very careful, because the vein recognition, according to the website, is the accuracy rate is 99%. So
in the labs.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I think we move on to His Excellency Ambassador. It's very interesting to note that there has been a lot of activities between Singapore and France. You have been taking the lead, and 21/8 has been very special for Singapore and France under your leadership. There were a lot of deeper collaboration between the French and Singapore innovation ecosystem, which both countries are working a lot of initiative in that areas. I remember there are so many events and activities being held in Singapore, and I believe that there are a lot of new agreements that has been signed. I'm not privy to that, so maybe you can share with us. So as you are introducing yourself, perhaps you could tell us a lot about the French and Singapore initiative, which is probably ending today. Is it today? Yeah. It's a 1 year ago that the previous president who initiated together. So maybe you tell us a little bit more about what are the outcomes, the landmark for the past 1 year.
Well, thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. Thank you also for recalling, the long-standing French presence in Singapore, and that's fully accurate. That the French even arrived here in 1819. So there were 2 French naturalists coming to Singapore with the raffles. And for those who are interested, I can show them the pictures. They are beautiful birds drawn by these 2 French naturalists. Just before the year of innovation, just let me try to explain very briefly why we jumped in this joint endeavor. First, it's because there is a very exceptional innovation ecosystem here in Singapore. It's based mainly on 2 things. First, the strategic location, and the fact that, clearly, Singapore, it's a gateway to China, to India, to Southeast Asia, and with this ambition also to be what I think Minister Heng Swee Keat called a trusted and neutral node in Asia. So basically, this node between also US and China. And if you allow me, I wanted also to mention another very powerful expression by Minister Chan Chun Sing, which is that to survive, Singapore, as a very small city-state, has to consider the whole world as its hinterland. And I think it tells a lot about the ecosystem of Singapore. The other thing is that because it is a city-state, so things are very, the ecosystem is very nimble, and changes can happen very quickly here, in a very, very fast-paced way. And so it's very interesting for foreign firms, to come to Singapore to test bed new technologies, including the regulatory dimension with sandbox that we can find on Fintech and so on. And so it's also interesting for Singapore, to tap on the French innovation ecosystem. And let me just recall, very briefly, but for a good innovation ecosystem, you need a good research, you need talents, you need funding. In France, we have the best incentives for R&D with the credit tax, 30%. We have, I think, well-known talents. 1 million engineers. We have a well-known school of mathematicians. If you look at the tech giants in the Silicon Valley, most of the AI departments are headed by French engineers. And funding, and there is an effort made by the current government, but it was the case with the previous governments as well. A national plan has been adopted for 46 billion public funding for research. And 27 billion euros have already been funded, and a special fund for disruptive technologies of 10 billion euros has been set up last year. So just to say, I mean, the why, I mean, we engage in this joint year of innovation. About the outcome, I won't elaborate too much because we circulated the brochure. And so I invite everyone, I mean, to look at this brochure, which is quite exhaustive, I mean, hopefully. But let me just say that in a nutshell, I mean, it was something like 60 events. We managed to conclude around 20 MOUs. And there were something like 12 ministerial visits on both sides. Our aim was three things. I mean, first, to build new tools. Second, I mean, to open new areas of collaboration. And third, to promote a certain pattern of innovation. New tools, we did it with the French tech community. So you may have heard of the French tech abroad, and now there is a French tech community in Singapore, 600 members, and they are very well inserted within the Singaporean ecosystem. And that's the purpose of the French tech, I mean, to help a French startup coming to Singapore to insert with all the different players and stakeholders of the ecosystem. And they have developed many activities. And we have also, when Panelists visited France last July, the decision was made to set up a GIA, a Global Innovation Alliance, which basically do the same for Singaporean startups, and it's the first which has been set up in Europe. There is another one in the US, in the Silicon Valley, and another one in China, Jakarta and Bangkok. And so I think it was a very strong signal, I mean, to have these two entities, the French tech community in Singapore, GIA in Paris, as the two landing pads, I mean, for startups who want to expand, I mean, their activities in Southeast Asia and Asia, and on the other side, I mean, in France and rest of Europe. And so this was a critical element of this. We also set up a joint committee for science and innovation, gathering all the key research organizations in France, CNRS, CEA, INSERM, with their counterparts in Singapore. And then we will have, I mean, this body to define the guidelines, the strategic guidelines for research together. I said also that we wanted to open new avenues of collaboration. We did it on AI. And so there is a MOU listing different specific issues like anonymity, healthcare, and so on, related to AI. And as you know, it's a top priority both in France and in Singapore. And so this is why there is a lot of political investment in this initiative. We did it also on space. And though, I mean, Singapore has no space agency per se, but has a lot of activities related to space. We, for instance, had seminars called, I mean, Innovate Together in Space, where we also considered the implications of new space, microsatellites and so on, how we can use space technologies for urban mobility. And also we decided to launch a feasibility study to develop together microsatellites for the Earth observation. And lastly, on circular economy, which is a key priority in Singapore, because you have announced, I mean, the towards zero waste year for 2019. And so we have just opened 2 days ago a joint laboratory at NTU with the CEA, the French Atomic Energy, which is on e-waste recycling, which is also a hot issue for Singapore, but not only. Promote a new approach on innovation, because we think that together we can also contribute to make innovation more inclusive and more responsible. And so that's something that we did, for instance, on climate change. We did it on inclusive finance. We did it also on gender equality with the Women's Forum, which was held for the first time in Singapore last September. And so these are the key elements of what we try to achieve through this year of innovation. Of course, I mean, we will pursue all these initiatives in the coming years.
It's amazing what we have achieved, Ambassador, and I think we are all very thankful to you for driving this initiative and hearing that there's so many events on inclusive innovation, and that's very much needed in this part of the world, especially a lot of them are not part of the economic and financial system. That is one area that I think is especially of interest to the Singapore FinTech community. And you have titled it as Year of Innovation. I just wonder whether you can change it at Years on Innovation, so that we have many more years of innovation together with the France government. Yeah. Thank you very much for giving us an overview of the outcome and the initiative. It's really interesting, especially on the satellite. Okay, and let's move on to Mohenty. The first time I saw you was probably 4 years ago, and that was the beginning of the journey for Singapore in the Fintech Innovation Group, in MAS, a new unit that being set up, and you were tasked to head it. And would you like to say a few things about your outcome for the past 4 years?
Sure. I think that will be a little bit of self-praise. So I will stay away from that. I think let's stick to the subject of what is disruption fintech, and we'll add to that as your main question. Thanks for having me here. I think it's good to define the 3-year journey or 4-year journey we did on how disruption has impacted financial services. And it was interesting because as David used, when I started my job, the story was there's a huge disruption coming from West, which will wipe out the whole incumbent financial services. And I think that's didn't happen. But there's something interesting happened as in this whole journey, which is, I think, something to share with the audience here. Over the last 4 years, we are seeing the whole space of innovation getting into 3 big buckets. The first one is called product innovation, which is essentially creating alternate products for the existing segment of customers, things like robo-advisory, and how do you take away customers from incumbent space for the same segment of customers and deliver a certain product. The second bucket, which perhaps the largest bucket in the whole space of financial services, which is interesting because that's not what when the fintech, the word was coined in post-global financial crisis, but it is kind of relevant in Asia in particular, that there's a B2B fintech rise, which happened primarily out of Asia, which was designed, these companies are designed to go and work with incumbent, how difficult it may sound, because incumbents are not good in partnering with the B2B fintechs, in generally speaking, but they came up strongly. And they were in the business of helping existing financial service providers with specific technology and product and services and how to transform them remarkably. There's a back office, middle office, or front office functions. A huge bucket went to that. And the third bucket are the disruptors, who essentially went and addressed a segment of customers post-global financial crisis, from where banks withdrew. And they created a relatively, I'll not say inferior product, relatively a product which is suitable for that segment. But as they gained understanding of that segment to a better product deployment, understand the regulation, they started going up the value chain. And that's where I'll bring an example. Thanks, so Bindru, sorry for making it you as an example here. Look at what happened yesterday to Lufax valuation. Lufax, if you know, is a part of the Ping An Group. And Ping An Group has a 30-year history. Am I right? 30-year history. And Lufax was created 8 years back as an alternate P2P lending product. And that valuation is $40 billion. I think 2 days back, and it exceeded the group valuation. So that's the third leg of disruptors who have taken a new product line, addressed a segment of customer, and created a value chain. And then what happened to Lufax is now, it has moved to wealth advisory now, which is typically an incumbent space. But they started from a product segment which was ignored by the financial services, and they grew through the maturity cycle. So these are the 3 big buckets of innovation happen in this space. Where do I see going forward? I think the second bucket will be the biggest bucket to rise. If you look at the latest round of investment, almost 60 to 70% of valuation or investors' money is now going into this B2B buckets, which means very good news for Singapore, very good news for France, because these are the countries which are traditionally strong engineering B2B focused country, where they don't have a large captive domestic market, but they have a strong engineering product which can go behind those engines and create a market for themselves. So both for Singapore and France, a rise of B2B fintech is excellent news, because that really fits into the strategy which they can formulate to drive some kind of market share in this whole growing space. So that's my summary of 4 years of the trend you see in the space of disruption and fintech.
That's only about 10% of the work that you're doing.
No, I think we'll come back to your subsequent questions around the role of public, role of government in the whole space. I think there's a huge topic. Hopefully, we'll discuss today the rise of public infrastructure in the space of fintech, which I'm personally invested in, and I think that will change the dynamics of how innovation is viewed as a complete private space growth.
Yes, it's really, the fintech community is really thankful to you for bringing, and your team for bringing the entire space forward. And it's very interesting that especially your work, later we talk more about financial inclusion in the areas and working with the aerospace in France.
Given you brought that point, I should, for the sake of audience, I think we have, there's one thing also must consider, the definition of what fintech. It was quite narrowly defined in many years back, that fintech is about payments, efficient payment system, or an alternate lending system. But fintech is a much more broader defined, especially in Singapore, in Asia, as an enabler of the digital economy, which I believe a huge shift will happen from physical to digital economy. And the kind of services you need, the kind of tools you need to support the digital economy is what fintech is providing, much bigger than what narrowly defined many years back.
It's amazing, because there are so many islands in Philippines, so many islands in Indonesia, and France is really good in satellite. The connectivity inclusion is one very important area to connect them before the digital can actually go forward.
Absolutely.
So the connectivity inclusion is something that I think both France and Singapore has a real advantage in reaching out to ASEAN. I will come back to you. Let's go to Nicolas. You are director and co-founder of the company called The Family, and it's an investment company that operates in London, Paris, and Berlin. I particularly like the name Family, as we had the conversation, because when you invest in a company, they become part of the family. There's a lot of advantage of being part of the family, but it also means that you can be part of the family, but you can never leave. So, but I think that's a very good, interesting name. We had a very good discussion. Could you tell us more about what you do and what's your investment philosophy?
Sure. So first of all, I'm very glad to be here. It's my first time in Singapore, and preparing the trip, I've been reading and watching a lot about the short but impressive history of your nation, and it's really a lesson taught in how you can overcome obstacles and embrace a strategic approach to economic policy that we, especially in Europe, would be well inspired to follow. So I co-founded The Family with two friends about 6 years ago. We started in Paris, and our ambition was to support early-stage ambitious entrepreneurs in Paris that had too many obstacles to overcome to succeed. We had that problem in France at the time, which was that we had many talented entrepreneurs. The level of ambition was very high, but those entrepreneurs failed nonetheless because they had difficulties accessing capital, overcoming regulatory barriers, and encountering so many other problems. And so we decided to tackle that challenge, and as an investment firm, to provide the support to a small portfolio of companies, but also to invest in educating their environment. And so fast forward to today, now we're 6 years later, we have actually 4 offices now. So we're in London, we're in Berlin as well, we're in Brussels. And so we operate from those 4 offices. What we operate is a single integrated platform that we provide to all entrepreneurs in our portfolio to make the point that they have to consider Europe not their own country as their battlefield. And so we've been doing that for 6 years. Before that, as David mentioned, I was part of the civil service in France. I was working for the French government. I did actually some work on the digital transition. I co-wrote a report 6 years ago as well on the future of corporate taxation in the digital economy. And so I've been trained in explaining everything related to technology to non-technology people. And starting in the civil service. And so, because Europe, as you know, is lagging so far behind the US, China, and even Southeast Asia in the global digital economy, we've decided as a firm to invest a significant fraction of our time to reaching out to people who don't belong in the startup world, and to try to explain to them what the digital economy is about, what startups are about, and how important they are to long-term economic growth. And so as part of that, I've been, well, traveling a lot for many years, speaking, writing, including more recently a book called Hedge, which is about reinventing the welfare state for the digital economy, so as to make it more inclusive and more sustainable. And, well, you might know that, but very few people read books. But nonetheless, when you've written a book, you're invited to talk about it. And so, since I've been writing this book, I've been traveling even more and in different parts of the world. And so and for us, the world is really divided in 3 parts. So there's Europe, which is our market. And so in Europe, whenever I travel to European capital, I do a lot of networking because it creates business opportunities for us. And we can address local entrepreneurs and invite them into the family. There's the US. The US, we don't have a business there, but the US is very important. The influence of Silicon Valley on the European startup ecosystem is critical. It's very important to know a lot of people there, and the more we know people in Silicon Valley, the more valuable our brand in Europe is. So I travel a lot to the US, and also because the West is in crisis in many respects at the moment, and so we really need to have that conversation about the transition and how to hedge against the adverse consequences of the transition. And if the US are missing in action in that conversation, it's a real problem for us in Europe. So I spend a lot of time trying to bridge that gap that is widening at the moment between Europe and the US, and so I travel a lot to the US. As for Asia, which is the third part, so Asia, we really don't have any business in Asia. It's too far, it's too different, and our startups are too early stage to be, and they're not interested yet in expanding on Asian markets. However, what's been happening in Asia recently with the rise of digital China and the rise of tech ecosystems in Southeast Asia is we now have proof that there's a non-US way to succeeding, a path to succeeding in the global digital economy. And what I'm very interested in here in Asia is to learn how how the different Asian ecosystems have managed to give birth to great tech companies, and how they've managed to do that in a very non-American way, with a different involvement of the state, with a different approach to local markets, to the cultural and fragmentation, and so on. And so I'm always keen to be here, and it's a real pleasure to listen to what everyone has to say here.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And following up from there, we can see a lot of different types of innovation landscape around the world. Europe is very different from China or India. Even in America, Silicon Valley is very different from New York. And in Singapore, we could also see there's on the one spectrum, really new startups, and then the other spectrum are very matured fintech ecosystem. I'm opening up this question, or maybe I can ask Ambassador first, is that, do you see a geopolitical pattern in terms of innovation, and how Singapore and France can ride on this new horizons that we have?
Well, thank you for that question. Actually, it's something that I realized during this year of innovation, that was probably beyond all the different collaborations that we have initiated, that was one of the key issues at stake. It was what kind of pattern or model of innovation we wanted to promote together. And I will try to oversimplify things, but basically, if you refer to the infrastructure of innovation, which is the cyberspace today, you have basically, I mean, three patterns, three model. And I think it was hinted to yesterday, but you have one kind of cyberspace based on surveillance, on the control of the flow of data. It could even lead, I mean, to censorship. And with this ideal of cyber sovereignty. On the opposite side, I mean, you have this approach which favors, I mean, laissez-faire, so with minimal intervention, with this idea that it will be conducive to more disruption, more innovation, but which is not something that should be taken for granted, because you could also consider that this model, I mean, leads to a kind of monopolization of data. And so there is no more level playing field between the different stakeholders. And so that creates also constraints for innovation. And so this is why, and I think it's something that I realized, I mean, over this year, I mean, that France as Singapore, and I would say Europe as Southeast Asian countries, I mean, are in a position where they don't want actually to choose between these two different patterns. And that's, I think Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said, we don't have to take sides. And so this is why I was referring, I mean, to this idea of Singapore as a neutral node. And reliable and trust, node of trust. And so this is something we share, this idea that there is a smart innovation which is based, and then I will say, I mean, the horrifying word, based on a certain level of regulation. And smart regulation. So what would that mean, I mean, smart regulation? It's a regulation which would provide a framework for people who innovate. And through this framework, the disruptors, the innovators would gain, I mean, stability, would gain predictability and trust. And these three things are absolutely necessary for people who do research, but also for the industry. In my previous position, I mean, I was on regular contact with industries, and the first thing they need, it's a framework, the rules of the games. If you take a sector like health, like financial services, the worst thing for them is uncertainty, no predictability, no trust. And so this is why a certain level of regulation is absolutely necessary. And it also contributes, I mean, to, for instance, if you want to have your product certified, that would give you, I mean, this reassurance. And then, I mean, you can much more easily, I mean, promote your product with this kind of certification. So this is clearly with this in mind that during this year of innovation, we launched few initiatives. I mean, the first was to adopt a roadmap at the highest level between Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and President Macron on digital innovation, cybersecurity, and governance of the internet. And with some key principles that both of us want to promote, and France doing, I mean, this outreach within the EU, and Singapore doing the same within the ASEAN, with this perspective to, at the end, having a kind of common platform between EU and ASEAN on some key principles of the governance of the internet. And that would have a huge impact, including with the big players or the great countries who at the UN, I mean, try maybe to not make the definition of a rule-based cyberspace so easy to obtain. We are very glad because last November, France launched what is called the Paris Call for Security and Trust in the cyberspace, and Singapore is the first Southeast country to have supported this Paris Call. The other good example, I think, it's on AI. Recently at Davos Forum, Minister Iswaran, I mean, announced this framework on AI and ethics towards the private sector. And we think this is absolutely key. And it relates to the level of trust required that I was mentioning. And so, as you know, AI also, it's a top priority in France. We have the G7 chairmanship this year, and there will be some key initiatives on AI and ethics. And we think that Singapore and France can really contribute together to foster, I mean, this agenda. And last thing, if you allow me, it's something that I have mentioned since my very first day in Singapore, but it's the issue about protection of data. And so since last May, I mean, the GDPR has been implemented. We consider that it's increasingly becoming an international norm, the EU regulation on protection of data. The first perception in Singapore was that there was an excessive focus on privacy, but over the last month, I think the perception has changed, and now there is a recognition that it also contributes, I mean, to facilitate trade flows between Southeast Asia and Europe. If you open an e-commerce platform in Singapore and you want to develop activities in Europe, you have to comply with the GDPR. And so in a mid perspective, I mean, I think that we have to consider the possibility to have what we call adequation mechanism between the regulation in Singapore and the GDPR. So these are probably, I mean, some key issues which relate, I mean, to your question about patterns of innovation.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador. I think you give a very clear exposition about the virtual world, because data sovereignty is key, because there's no sovereignty over the virtual world. So, and most of the behavior that's driving all the innovation are by human. So it is a human behavior offline that we can actually regulate and impose a certain either self-regulation, ethical rules, or legislation or regulation to ensure that we human behave in a proper way, so that even though the WWW is supposed to be World Wide World, it becomes Wild Wild West, because there's nobody online, and the hackers will then split into two groups of ethical hackers and the dark hackers. And Mohenty, you have been traveling around the world and see the different kind of landscape, and you probably see a very different area. I know Nicolas is going to talk about taxation on virtual world, where there's no governance as of now, international governance. But when you see as a regulator in different countries and how difficult it is for everybody to come together in this different landscape, what are the challenges? How different are they? What are the hindrances to have a new horizons for the new economy?
I've given you talk I will talk about opportunities, not challenges. So let me try to, because Ambassador spoke about trust, stability, neutrality, data, and you spoke about the Wild West web. I think there is a shift, and I think this is where I want to frame a concept here, that there's a rise of, especially a sector, like again, Ambassador mentioned about health. Similarly, in financial sector, there is a space for a trusted public infrastructure, which allows a complete re-architecting of the whole digital economy when it comes to financial services. So let me come back. Let me put this in an idea form. The first I of an idea is called identity. I think that's a fundamental public infrastructure must be in place, among all countries, because identity is the genesis of the subsequent data creation, and all the data privacy concerns stems from this idea that you have a digital identity and the set of data associated with the identity. I think, my friend Binru may argue saying that we know how to establish identity using a lot of biometrics, but I think I will argue against it, saying that identity is a national asset. It's the right of every citizen. It has to be protected. It has to be created by the state as a state national identity, a digital identity, fundamental. Then comes D, the data part, because any data associated with the identity is critical for us to innovate and maintain privacy. There are certain public good of data being, some data being anchored with the identity as a public good. Things like KYC, know your customer. There's a certain element of data associated with identity which I strongly advocate for as a public good, as a KYC utility, because that drives the subsequent data creation on top of the base data which you own as an individual. Then comes the experimental stack, which I believe should be another public good, which allows a collaboration between France, Singapore, India, China. If we build a sandbox, a global sandbox on top of this I and D, and which allows certain data to be kept there, and different collaborators can come and experiment on that experimental layer, which allows a very thoughtful, stable, trusted things to be built. And that leads to me the A of the idea, which is the apps on the top of that. So all the apps which get created, and that's where bright company like OneConnect will come in, and they will start building a lot of apps which relies on that shared experimental framework, a national identity framework, and a trusted data framework. And that kind of leads to a more sustainable innovation and much more inclusive. I think your other point, are you excluding people from this whole process? Because you should not exclude a lot of countries, because they need certain innovation to happen, and not every time a private sector cannot solve it. Even if they solve it, they create closed wall gardens. It will be very closed one. It will be like my data, my identity, nobody can come here, I dominate. That's the unintended consequence we see from large tech companies, which can create concentration risk. So how to avoid those unintended consequences is to start building a shared global stack framework on idea principles. That's my little summary on how I think we should look at, rather than worried about data privacy as a tail side of the problem, but fix the fundamentals.
Very interesting, because the virtual world basically it is borderless, you know.
Yes.
The borders and the war comes from human and geographical, and the policy can break those down, and then we don't have a situation of the tragedy or the common, which we talk a lot about. So incentive becomes important. And you know, the government policy needs to give enough incentive for, you know, everybody to become, like Ambassador say, a node in the entire virtual world. And the node is, that's the identity, digital identity, establishing a trusted digital identity in the digital economy is the fundamental core product which has to be anchored in every state policy, which allows a more sustainable, inclusive development. Yeah. And you don't talk about challenges. I think I think I didn't want to. I think there are challenges which I think I should not ignore. Sorry, maybe I'll do a couple of minutes on challenges. There are challenges on data policy. I think a lot of countries have taken a policy of data protection in a very very I'll not say wrong way, in a very short reaction or a quick reaction, knee-jerk reaction to the data policy. I think the immediate reaction on data has been that wall garden the data. My data stay in my country, cannot be shared anybody. In almost like a reverse narrative or a counter narrative to globalization. If data gets stuck in country, is not shared, then we may have a challenge in creating a much more connected global digital economy. But having said that, data has a privacy to be dealt with. There's certain data it has to be managed. There's a governance. There's a control. We are talking about, I think we are talking one new idea called data corridor, trusted data corridor. Can two countries bilaterally establish data corridors so that we trust each other policies and data can be established? There's a very provocative idea called data embassy. Similar how embassies are located in a country, there's a sovereign right ambassador has on his embassy areas. Can he also
has a right to French data sitting in Singapore as a sovereign access to data. So data embassy is a new construct being talked about. So data is one challenge, policy challenge to be settled with. The second is the whole access, sharing of data, especially in the cyber world, because cyber security, money laundering, terrorism financing, that requires a lot of data to be shared by multiple jurisdictions. Unfortunately, in the world of digital, data tend to get mixed and very hard to segregate this data I want to share, this data I don't want to share. And that sharing of information has become a big challenge for digital economy to grow in the way you like to grow and more inclusive in the end state.
Yeah, I think standardization becomes important, not only in the virtual world, but also documentation, because trade documentation tend not to be standardized in a very chaotic manner in different countries, and there are a lot of legislation as well of court procedures that require a certain kind of data format, which I think internationally there is an area of fruitful discussion of how to standardize even physical trade document before we talk about.
And I was in, Luis is here from BIS. I was in Basel 2 days back. I learned something interesting. They were talking about, one of the panelists in the conference was talking about, if we standardize, easy for hacker to hack. One hacking, everything is done. So sometimes standardization can have very unintended consequences in a digital world. It allows a single way to crack the whole system. Sorry, yeah. I had to bring it. Luis was here, so this was one thing I learned in Basel.
Yeah. So we're going to think of a new way to increase the cost of hacking. I raised the issue about challenges because I think Nicolas will agree with me, because we both are professors and we do investment. We love to look at challenges because we believe there's no utopia, and when there's utopia, there's no opportunity. So for a professor in strategy and for us as an investor, we always hope that there's no utopia, so that there's always opportunities. And one of the challenges I think that facing the government will be tax revenue, because without taxation, with no revenue, government cannot exist. And in the virtual world, we talk a lot about e-commerce. We talk a lot about how we can tax. And think these few days in France, that is a major issue. Would you enlighten us, since you have been working in that area, about taxation in France as well?
Sure. So the overall narrative that I'm using a lot is to go back into history, have a look at what happened about 1 century ago when the economy moved from the old 19th century economy to the Fordist model that eventually dominated the 20th century. And when that paradigm shift happened, it didn't go without pain and a lot of suffering and a lot of tension and a lot of and the rise of fascism and wars and so on. And it's all related in a way, because shifting paradigms is very hard and societies are not equipped to deal with such challenges. And so when you realize that we're going through a similar transition today, you realize that we have to do the same thing. We have to run the same race that every country that became a developed country in the 20th century had to run. And that race is divided in 2 parts. The first part is, if you want to succeed in the digital economy, in the new paradigm, you need to build great tech companies. And that, because those companies are the ones who will eventually dominate the market at a global level, who will create value and capture value and concentrate value and turn it into wealth in your country. But that's only the first part of the race. The second part of the race is that you need to build, to invent and to build the new institutions that will make this new economy more sustainable and more inclusive. And those institutions are of many in many different respects. So we need to invent a new copyright law. We need to invent new regulations for privacy. We need to invent a new welfare state. That's the topic of my book. And we need to invent a new tax system. Because if you look back at the tax system that we inherit from the past, you realize that most of its components were invented in the 20th century to account for the changing nature in the economy at the time. Personal income tax was invented in most developed countries in the West in the first 10 to 20 years of the 20th century. Then VAT was invented by a Frenchman in the 1950s and eventually spread around the world. Corporate taxation was invented, the current system that we have, the corporate taxation ruled by the principle of no double taxation, so the same profit shouldn't be taxed twice by two different countries. That was invented by a group of economists working for the League of Nations in the 1920s. And so if you realize that personal income tax was invented in the 1910s, corporate tax was invented in the 1920s, and VAT was invented in the 1950s, they all were invented in the context of the Fordist economy. And they were all designed in line with what the Fordist economy was about. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise that now that the economy is not Fordist anymore, but it's becoming more digital, we have to reinvent every component of the tax system. We have to reinvent personal income tax to account for the radically different nature of our careers and professional lives today, and our income is not as steady as it used to be when we used to work 30 years in the same company in the Fordist economy. Today, the personal income is much more complex and much less steady than in the past. Well, VAT used to be a brilliant system, very efficient. It's not working anymore. There are many problems because the economy is becoming more digital and transactions are becoming more digital. And corporate taxation, finally, also creates problems because the principle of no double taxation means that you can tax the profits made by a company only if part of that profit was formed on your territory as a country. And the concept that is key to assessing that is the concept of permanent establishment. So you have the right as a tax authority to tax a fraction of the profit of a multinational corporation, only if there's a permanent establishment on your territory. And the definition of a permanent establishment is still the one that was drafted by those economists in the 1920s. And it mentions that to have a permanent establishment, you need to have an office, a factory, a workshop, employees, tangible assets, or some intangible assets like a brand or a patent, and so on. Today, value creation does not rely exclusively on those assets, tangible assets and brands and patents. A growing part of value creation relies on the contribution of individual users, because what tech companies are about is they're about connecting all of us through networks because we're using the same applications and collecting data from us and using those data to provide us with a better experience. And so as a result, we're all contributing as internet users to creating value and to generating the profits made by those companies, not only because we pay for their products, but also because we take an active part in creating the product itself. And so it should call for either redefining what a permanent establishment is or changing the rules in the corporate tax system. But what is true for corporate tax, and corporate tax is a very hot topic because we all want large corporations to pay more taxes. They're big, they're profitable, they're successful. So the common sense is that, well, you're big, so you should pay more taxes, when in fact they pay less taxes, as you know. And so it's a very hot topic, but if you know the tax system, you know that corporate tax doesn't represent the majority of government revenues. What's much more important today is reinventing VAT to account for the new value chains in the digital economy, reinventing personal income tax to account for the radically different nature of personal income in this more innovative and entrepreneurial economy. So we have a lot ahead of us. The OECD is making huge progress on that front, especially in the recent period, because following the tax reform, the US is now in favor of reinventing many things at the global level. But for many years, until the US became an active proponent of global tax reform, the fear of Western countries was that the new tax system would be invented not in the West by Western nations, but by China and Brazil and South Africa and large emerging countries. And so it's a very interesting period, and I can't stress enough the importance of that second part of the race. If you want to win, you need first to build great tech companies, and second to build new institutions. If you only run the first part of the race, you won't be a sustainable, developed economy in the future. If you're focused only on the second part of the race, regulations, without first building the great tech companies, like in Europe, it doesn't work as well.
Thank you very much for the ideas, but it does seem that a lot of government are actually looking at central bank digital currency and offering open source software, so that in the event that you have transaction, there will be transaction fee that is collected, and from there may be one area to look into, and I can see a lot more government taking a lead in that, hoping that more people will build an app on top. I think Mohenty will be able to tell you more about that.
I agree. Digital currency is a key part of the new infrastructure that we need to deploy if we want to reinvent the tax system.
Yeah, especially now that we have pension fund shortages, and that become a key issue. How do we ensure that there's a good, we can make the money, we can make the wealth, but it has to be distributed, the wealth has to be distributed fairly evenly, and I think digital asset may be one way to bypass minimum income, because whatever you consume, you have a stake in there. So it's that like some of the companies of like ATech that I know, the funds are given by the government, but the recipients only see the products and the services. They don't see the cash. So it's a little bit more debatable whether we should have a narrow choice of consumption, but for the bottom of the pyramid, that may be something that digital currency and smart contract will be able to do. Before I go to Binru, I would like to open to the floor for questions. So think about the questions. In a few minutes, I'm going to come to you, and you can actually ask some questions for the panel members. Binru, your parent company is from China, and the technology is from China. So you see different innovation culture. What are the differences, and how are you able to so successfully use the technology from China for Singapore and the region? You're going to the region, different countries. How do you reconcile that cultural differences and cross the border?
Okay, a very interesting question, because I'm also like first time joining a Chinese company, honestly speaking. I've worked previously in Microsoft and then previously in HP, so all my life in the tech Southeast Asia journey has been a US company's perspective. And then I started losing deals to the Chinese. I wasn't losing deals to the AWS or the Google. And when I start losing deals to the Chinese, I decided that now is the time to switch my career to find out really what are the Chinese doing right. So I'm Singaporean, right? I actually studied a lot of the Chinese companies before I decided that Ping An is the right company to join. Singapore is the neutral, reliable point that we decided is best for Southeast Asia, and Ping An has a belief that local people to do the local work. And despite having Peter Ma having we have 1.8 million employees in China, and there's no lack of talents in China, so he can easily find another CEO here, but he's chosen to select a Singaporean. So I'm Singaporean. I'm 3 generations. I'm the first generation of Singaporean in Singapore. And most of the team right now, almost 80% are either, they're all Southeast Asia talents. They're from Southeast Asia, they're Singaporeans, they're Singaporean PRs, right? So we believe in local people to do the local work. Then you can truly make use of what we think is the best point of expansion for Southeast Asia. So that's one. So resources, that's the local talent. That's one big thing about the cross-border. The other thing also, I think, is close collaboration with the regulator, right? Despite the fact that Mohenty said that I would not agree to certain things, I actually am very agreeable with what the authorities are saying, right? With regards to the need for national ID, we believe that a lot of things can start from Singapore. Because Singapore is small enough to test a lot of new technologies. So that's also the reason why we set up an innovation lab. I asked for a couple of things for Singapore as the correct location and having the correct enablement for Southeast Asia. So not only was I losing in terms of pricing, I was losing in terms of product specs. So the emerging countries, like I spent a lot of time in Myanmar, and Myanmar was looking for, that's when the technology really makes a difference in their lives, right? Much more satisfying than selling, say, to a DBS or OCBC in Singapore. If you sell a good piece of technology to the Burmese bank, I feel that it really made a difference to people adopting, having a bank account, really enjoying a difference. The farmer really needed the funding, etc. But in terms of the specs from the emerging countries, they were much closer compared to the specs that's from Europe or from US, because there was a natural assumption of good infrastructure in place, and the Chinese solutions are much more flexible in terms of pricing and specs. So from a product specs perspective, I have asked for an innovation lab in Singapore, because a Chinese solution cannot be assumed that you can be plug and play into Southeast Asia. So not only do we want to localize the language, we want to customize to the Southeast Asia needs. So we do have an innovation lab in Singapore that we do all of these before. So I would think that we, from a product specification perspective, Singapore doing that customization, having that governance structure, having the talent pool, will probably be our strength in terms of expansion into Southeast Asia. One other thing I would touch is on what Mohenty said about there are 3 categories of fintech. We belong to the middle class, so I'm so glad he said the middle class is going to be doing well in terms of supporting the banks, because a lot of fintech startups wants to be a bank after a while, and there are good reasons why they want to be a bank after a while. There are also good reasons why they usually fail the moment they think they want to be a bank from a tech company. And OneConnect, we have what we think enables the banks well. We don't do a to C model. I don't sell anything directly to the customer. My target audience are the banks. But the key challenges is really the banks cannot just take a piece of solution and the collaboration is done. The collaboration today, I would say, is maybe shallow to a certain extent, because the banks will create a sandbox, they looked at all the fintech solutions, they play within the sandbox, innovation is taken on a very small scale. And the reason is simply because the bank is huge and they have their own transformation to do, and their own transformation is taking time. So today I think there's the intent to collaborate is there. So we're seeing a lot of wanting, the banks are very interested to try little things. But in Ping An's learnings, because OneConnect basically came from Ping An, and so we integrate the tech deep into the Ping An organization. And so it's not a pilot or a small-scale innovation, right? For every tech that we feel really makes a lot of sense, it goes really deep into the organization. And I'm hoping for the day that will come that we will recognize the fintech that is very strategic for long-term growth with the banks, that can really collaborate much deeper state than what we're doing currently today. Yeah, so I'll pause here a little.
Very, very, very interesting, because you really touched on the point of new horizon for the new economy, the disruption, the fintech and the innovation. And I read that actually OneConnect serves 450 banks, right? With your cloud platform, with your blockchain platform, and you serve 2,100 quasi financial institutions in China. The scale is amazing. With the technology, you can automate, you can lower the cost of doing business, you can reach out to new customers, which previously wasn't profitable to service. But now with technology, you could actually go deeper into it and making something with an economy of scale. And with Ping An, which is originally insurance, you are now providing cloud services, you are now having chip production, you have an economy of scope. So it's very interesting to see the kind of new horizon in the sense that you really have to look for new products, and you really have to look for new customers using technology rather than just focusing on the same customer and try to leverage the same customer or make the product more complex. And this is some of the, the hindrance or the challenges of some of the incumbents that I'm seeing. Yeah, I would like to open to the floor for questions. I'm sure there are a lot of, we have a gentleman there. Please let us know your name and affiliation and the question directed to which panel member.
Good morning, the panel. Since yesterday and today, we have been talking about rules, ethics, code of conduct, blah, blah. And how do you deal in the new context, the global situation, where all these accord rules and ethics are being made and agreed upon to be broken by somebody coming to take over? For example, Donald Trump is breaking all the known rules, even withdraw from the nuclear, blah, blah. The other one, the whole morning, the panel have been talking about digitalization, etc. But the word blockchain have been missing. Why? Thank you.
Okay. The question is directed to you. To me? Yeah. Okay. Well, I think you don't need to mention about blockchain anymore because it's part of the technology that will be the base layer technology as I'm concerned. For identity and also for services, for app to go on top, I think it's important to realize that there is a major difference between the physical world and the virtual world. In the physical world, we can have centralized authority, we can have centralized government. But the minute you go online, on chain, your coding itself decide how the governance is being done. So blockchain is actually coded governance. And it's important to have off-chain centralized governance, to have somebody in charge to decide what code to be in there. And then blockchain will become the base layer. Why is it important? Because I think we have mentioned earlier that the cost of hacking must continue to increase as we serve more people. So natural stabilizer for hacking is to increase the cost of hacking. And blockchain has this advantage that as every nodes that come in, the marginal cost of scaling is almost zero, because if you want to join the blockchain, it's open source software, whether it's provided by the government or private enterprise. But all the cost is yours. Your electricity cost is yours, the nodes is yours. If you are a bank, you have no technology, if someone offer you a free software, you will jump on board. And that's how you scale over time. But more importantly, each of you have a private key or multiple signature private key. There will be other cryptography technology like secret sharing, zero knowledge, and so on to protect your privacy. So blockchain, as I understand, because if you look at the IMDA report, which is the Infocom Media Development Authority of Singapore, our Singapore technology map, when it refers to blockchain, it's about distribution of trust online. Online, you have to distribute trust. You cannot have a centralized trust where a hacker can hack into it easily. So blockchain is taken to me as a given because it's a distribution of trust. And the other layer of that is privacy protection. You need to have privacy protection online. So we can see how dangerous it is that if you do business based on a social media app and there's an outage for a few hours, your business will be affected. So you need to have a decentralized network so that even part of the nodes are being under attack, you will still have other nodes working, that the network will continue. So that is the reason why I don't think we need to highlight blockchain. Blockchain is embedded. I don't know whether the rest of the panel...
I just want to add to your nice explanation. What has happened is that what we are seeing a more crystallizing, very, very early stage still, that the distributed part of the operation is getting more and more real. It's getting institutionalized in the new software architecture. The distribution of governance is still questioned. I think there is a need for having a safety breaker in case there is a unintended consequence in the distributed network. So I think governance will still remain central. Trust will be distributed, operation will be distributed, governance stays with some central party or some kind of consensus in the whole process. Talking about AI ethics, somebody can, the president you referred to can decide to break. In a digital world, ironically, it's very difficult to break away because already coded in the system. You think about, can somebody break a rule and create a new internet node? Very difficult. They have to follow certain agreed protocols already embedded in the system. So my response to your question, as we get more digitally connected, the digital economy will, in a way, it has got inbuilt mechanism to not allow people to break away to all the agreement being coded into the system. The cost of doing it and the practicality of doing it is too high for anybody to break away if we agree on ethics, AI, data, privacy, all the construct.
Yes, I wanted to add. So in my firm, we have a rule, is that we try not to talk too much about specific technologies. And the reason for that is that too many people confuse entrepreneurship with research and development. And people in the world of research and development are obsessed with specific technologies, and they used to talk about the cloud and then the smartphones and big data and chatbots and AI and now blockchain and so on. But if you reason like that, you miss the mark, because what's important for entrepreneurs is people and the problems they have and how you can harness existing technology to solve that problem and eventually turn that solution into a profitable business. And so technology is only a means to an end. And if you focus too much on the technology, you lose sight of what really matters, which is the problem you're trying to solve. And so I've been used to explaining that beyond the differences between those different generations of digital technologies, there's a common thread that links them all, and it's about more computing, so more computing power, and more networks. That is, people are more and more connected together. And if you learn to reason like that in terms of computing and networks, not in terms of AI and blockchain and big data and whatever, you realize that there's a long-term trend that creates many opportunities to tackle many challenges.
Yeah, maybe I'll just, well, Nick just said technology doesn't really matter. I was going to say about our blockchain, but nevertheless, I will continue. So in OneConnect solution, I only touch a couple on the AI, but actually all our technologies are AI-based and blockchain. And actually, in many ways, we're trying to combine the two in solutions. Like, for example, we just went live with the Hong Kong Trade Finance platform. So OneConnect built the Hong Kong Trade Finance platform, started with 7 banks, now there are 14 banks. And like what David said, the real plus of blockchain, there are many pluses. I think one of the bigger plus, because I started many years ago doing EDI exchanges between banks, and just doing one EDI exchange, it takes like 3 to 6 months to set up one connection, let alone 2 or 3 parties to talk to each other. 14 banks on Hong Kong Trade Finance, we completed in 6 months, and the project went live with real transactions. So we're very proud of that. I think onboarding in a big ecosystem is much faster and much lesser cost.
Just to add a provocative point on blockchain, if we don't talk about technology, it can actually question the whole cloud computing. It may move to edge computing. The computing became more distributed. It also can question the big data need. It can be talking of small data, because data can sit where they are. You can compute where they need to be computed and bring AI as a way to aggregate knowledge. So AI becomes the aggregator, computation becomes distributed, data becomes distributed, so you don't have to worry about big data and computing resources. As a way to think the whole AI, blockchain, and data.
So in fact, there will be a convergence of technology, because I don't think all problems can be solved by blockchain alone. So we need to harness the best feature of all technologies, from AI. They call it ABCD in Ping An's AI, blockchain, cloud, and data technology. I tend to add on 2 more. One is prefab, which I think is very important because the hardware side, which is what we are talking about, Huawei is all about AI chip. There is a prefab side, the design thinking, and Q, which is quantum computing that is about to surface fairly quickly that all of us actually in the technology field is spending a lot of time looking into quantum computing, prefab, embedded software, trusted executable environment. Those are the technical new horizons that we are talking about. And in fact, that's what Singapore budget, we talk about the three areas, which is blockchain, prefab, as well as embedded software. But certainly there are a lot more in those areas. Do we have another question? One last question before yeah, there's quite a few. Okay. Ladies first. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for your comments and insights. I'm Roshni Bernadette. I'm a journalist and occasionally an academic. My question to the panel, to whoever is comfortable to answer this question, is on transportation, healthcare, Franco-Singaporean collaboration, and innovation. If I could make just 3 brief points before I give you my question. We face different challenges in our world economy. For example, on the transportation front, a consciousness to acquire and deliver transportation systems that reduce carbon emissions or our carbon footprint. On the healthcare front, providing long-term solutions for asthma and chronic respiratory complications, which are the fallout and consequence of climate change. So here's my question to you. To what extent does the collaboration between France and Singapore in the realms of transport and healthcare factor in innovation to address the challenges, the new challenges we face in the area of climate change in our world economy? Thank you.
Maybe we can have another question and then we can...
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm C.S. Wong, I'm a Singaporean. I'm interested in the Sweden experiment on crypto, their currency as an e-currency, and how does it work, and would Singapore be looking into adopting a similar version of it? Thank you.
Okay. Ambassador, you want to take the first question?
Thank you. You're combining, different dimensions, healthcare, transport, climate change. We have developed over the last 2-3 years an experiment between CNRS, the French National Research Organization, and NUS on aging. And it's a program which aims at defining together some practical solutions to make the life of the elderly improved. And it's based on a very concrete, solutions like putting sensors inside HDB, where you collect data, and then you can identify when there is a phenomenon of frailty, and you also deploy data outside, around the vicinity of the HDB, precisely, for taking into account the urban mobility dimension. And so this is a joint collaboration between France and Singapore, where, because we do the same in France also, and so, combining the set of data helps the different companies like AXA, the insurance company, but also Sigfox, which is an IoT startup, but also PSA, the car manufacturer, to identify solutions and to develop, new devices to, help the elderly, both in Singapore, France, and the rest of the world also, to benefit, from these very practical solutions. So just to give you an example, the other thing we did through the French Chamber of Commerce, it's that we have developed what we call smart health platform, which is very much directed at towards the users in Singapore, hospitals, different healthcare companies, and where you could I mean, benefit from all the expertise that have been developed here in Singapore, but also in France.
Thank you, Ambassador. The second, you want to add something?
Am I able to just share some of the healthcare? I think fintech today have expanded in scope because a lot of these technologies are actually very applicable to other verticals. So in Ping An, we ported the fintech solutions into a lot of health tech. So we invest a lot in health tech. Like for example, the pensions that the elderly is collecting from the government. Because China is so huge, the elderly can't possibly be collecting their pensions from a particular, coming to the capital city to collect their pension. So a lot of, they have on behalf, maybe their kids are collecting on behalf of them using their IDs, etc. But over time, the Chinese government have realized that people are getting, the percentage of over 100 years old elderly and still living seems to be increasing, and only to find out that actually maybe they are no longer there. It's just that the youngsters are still collecting the pension. So we implemented then, we launched for China the facial recognition for the pension collection. So the elderly could stay at home, they need not travel, and they could use facial recognition and collect their pensions accordingly. That's one example. The other is actually on the lung nodule analysis. So radiologists have a tough time, you know, you need experienced radiologists to tell you whether or not you have this little thing that's very small as 3 mm, kind of 0.3 mm is smaller than your hair. There's a lung nodule that's in your lungs to detect any early signs of cancer. And what we did is we trained the AI engine to be able to detect possible nodes for investigation. It helps the radiologists a lot. And in such a way that we need not have very senior radiologists or maybe a tired radiologist can still, with the aid of AI, be able to detect such. Yeah. Then, of course, the other one that's very well known is our Good Doctor app. Right? So basically, every insurance policy that you buy in China from Ping An Insurance comes with this Good Doctor app that allows you to do virtual consultation. Today, we have 250 million active users on the app, and it's increasing by 25% year on year all the time. So Good Doctor is recently listed, and we've also partnered with Grab to make sure that Grab users in the future can also use this in other countries. But most of the people who use these apps for virtual consultations are mothers with young kids, or women who doesn't want to travel far out for women issues, right? So virtual apps are proven to be popular to address certain parts of it. So it's been, pickup rate has been very good. Yeah.
Thank you. Mohenty, you want to respond to the national currency?
If I understood, I don't think Swedish have issued any e-krona yet. There is a desire to experiment something early this year. I think Sweden has with the existing digitalization of their own system, people are using less and less cash. They're in a situation where most of the transaction is digitally run. I think they are now experimenting with an idea of a two-tier system, one registering a digital currency with the central bank and one a value-based system with the companies or the account owners. But that's a very early stage experiment. There are certain policy challenges in doing such retail digital currency during crisis. What happens? So I would say I think my only response now is to see these experiments how they're coming. But from Singapore perspective, we are experimenting through our project Ubin, wholesale digital currency, which has got operational efficiency benefit, especially for wholesale payment and cross-border transactions. But we still have not found strong reason or strong argument why we should issue digital currency. We have a reason to think about wholesale, not of retail digital currency yet. I think the existing digitalization of processes through wallet, through Pay Now, and all the PayLah, my friend from DBS is here. I think with all this great thing happening, Pay Now, I think we can deal with the whole digital journey using existing tools and services.
I'm running out of time, so only one final question and 1 or 2 sentences from each panel members. The final question is, who will be the winners? Nicolas.
Well, I go back to my comment about running a race that's divided in 2 parts, and I must say that today, well, the US has already won the first part of the race, but they don't realize they have to run the second part that is building new institutions to make the economy more inclusive. So they're far from being the winners. As for Europe, we're very interested in the second part of the race, coming up with regulations and new institutions, but we still have to run the first part. We don't have the great tech companies. And so the region I see as the winner is Asia, and especially China, because China is running very fast on the two fronts. They have the great tech companies, but they also, because they're a developing economy, they have the room to maneuver, to invent new institutions, and especially in the welfare state. Well, when it comes to the welfare state, you might have heard about the social credit system. I think it's the layer they're deploying to provide people with more benefits and more social protection. So they're actually running the two parts of the race. And
okay, Mohenty.
I'm struggling to get a third term, not winner or loser. I think the reason I say that is because if you take the spirit of fintech, why fintech becomes successful? They're extremely customer focused. They're only customer focused. They work on agile technology, and they are very good adopting faster and cheaper technology. With the rise of with the rise of national infrastructure on digital assets and digital technology, there'll be, I don't think any country will dominate the space will happen, because what will happen, every country, every state will create a necessary digital infrastructure which will come as strangely as a gap for dominant companies to expand themselves and dominate the economy. It will be distributed economy. It will be much more balanced. There will be less concentration of wealth, which I think we all want. So there will be no winners and losers. It will be much more distributed, shared wealth distribution.
Desired outcome. Yes. I want to give Ambassador the last word. So, Binro.
No, hard to say losers or winners. I mean, we collaborate with the financial ecosystem to make this successful. So I think it's going to be a journey together for sure. It's going to be a marriage that will benefit both sides. Yeah. So China is definitely in the lead. But from what I learned in Ping An, China is also trying to be international. So certain things may speed up, certain things may slow down. From an AI perspective, actually, I think if I had the luxury of taking every single solution that I had from the Ping An group, I would apply hardly 30% in Southeast Asia. In terms of data that's available, willingness to adopt, or use case, is probably less than 30%. So Southeast Asia has a lot of potential. Of course, a lot of challenges, but a lot of potential to take the lead.
Ambassador, you have the last word.
Thank you. I want to answer the question, but no, I think the real challenge is that how to assure that all the different players will, get together and agree to play the game, playing with the same rules of the game. I'm saying this because you have, some worrying trends. The paradox is that the cyberspace was some kind of unifying instrument, and that we are observing at the moment it's a cyberspace which is getting more and more fragmented. And you have even players, who have a very sovereign perception of this instrument. And so that you may have a situation where people are not even in a position, to play together. So I think this is why the common thread of our intervention, is that we should actually, support open innovation. And Mohenty, for instance, mentioned some ideas about global sandbox, data corridors, and these kind of very practical tools, which contribute to safeguard, this open innovation framework. And this is why, again, there is this need for a certain level of regulation which will contribute, to foster innovation. And I think this is a shared interest between France, Singapore, and EU, ASEAN, which is increasingly recognized by both parties.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure that we are all here. Therefore, I wish that the winners, one of the winners will be Singapore and French together. We are the winner. But just to conclude, I think what I'm hearing is that the 4 areas is very important. Let's hope that the winner will be inclusive, and getting inclusive is important. Sustainability, whoever can handle sustainability the best. customer, not only old customer, but create more new customer so that there will be new jobs. And also new products, not the existing product that make it more complex. I think if these 4 criteria is our desire, I think I'm sure the panel member will agree with me, as well as you that will agree with me. And with that, I would like you to put your hands together to thank a very fantastic panel. And thank you for your attention.